pass it over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 12th International Conference on the Constructed Environment, Design Reset. It is my great pleasure to present Alejandra Menchaca as the plenary speaker of this conference. Alejandra is a vice president in the sustainability practice at Thornton Tomasetti, where she leverages her backgrounds in mechanical engineering and building science to provide project teams with advanced sustainable design knowledge, as well as energy modeling and occupant comfort expertise. She leads the firm's research efforts, which are aimed at gaining a deeper understanding of the impact unique technologies and design strategies have on a building's performance. Alejandra is a voting member of ASHRAE Standard Project Committee 62, a member of the USGBC Environmental Quality Technical Advisory Group, and the technical committee member of the IBIPSA Boston chapter. She holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT with a focus on building technologies, and has lectured at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I had the pleasure of being her student there, and now, on behalf of Universidad de Monterrey, I have the pleasure to introduce Alejandra once again as a plenary speaker of Design Reset. Alejandra, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored. Very excited to be here today. I got a chance to look at the program and it's fascinating and very diverse. And so I was trying to figure out how, what could I talk about? I do so many things in my life. What could I talk about that could potentially touch some of you? And so I decided to focus this morning in talking about how we incorporate the value of wellness into practice. As Esteban mentioned, I spent a fair amount of time in grad school and doing research and have now migrated into the reality of consulting. And there are many things that many of you have noticed, many of you are academics. And so I know that many times as academics, we focus on many things that are ideal and quantifying things that are very controlled, which is really useful. Sometimes in practice, it does not quite work that way. Sometimes the information does not get quite transmitted as it should. And so I really want to talk a little bit about that bridge of what happens when you do the research and what happens when you go into practice and it works or it doesn't work. Just as, just to spark some thoughts as you have more discussions in this conference. And so with that, and in particular, I decided to focus on wellness just because wellness is becoming, particularly since 2 years ago, very relevant topic for clients, for owners, as we think about designing buildings, operating buildings. And so, but oftentimes people don't see the value because it's hard to come up with a numerical value that will justify an investment, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about that and how we do that in practice. And with that, I'm going to get started. As many of you know, we spend most of our time indoors. And so therefore the built environment and the indoors should be taking most of our energy in terms of what we think about when we're designing buildings. Now there's indoors and there's indoors, right? You can sense immediately that these two, while they're both indoors, they feel very different. And from a wellness standpoint, they are quite different. If we could talk about what the difference is between these two, what the differences are, where you can see that there's daylighting in one, there's greenery, right? The right scenario gives us contact to greenery, to nature, gives us views out, gives us a feeling of warmth, from a comfort standpoint, etc. Whereas the environment on the left, hopefully you will agree with me, is not ideal from a wellness standpoint. It's really just a box, right? And so, well, engineers, and I am one, when we talk about energy, oftentimes we say, well, maybe the most efficient thing would be to just take a box. And that's going to be the most efficient. The reality is that we need a balanced wellness with building design. Many of you might be familiar with the CBE survey on occupant comfort. This is research done by Professor Schiavone at Berkeley, where they've evaluated from thousands of occupants, they've evaluated what satisfaction level do they have from various buildings and within various buildings. As you can see, and I really want you to focus at the bottom, right? Because this might resonate with many of you. Sound, privacy, noise level, and temperature and air quality. are the 4 lowest ranked occupant satisfaction variables within buildings in general, right? I'm sure you all would agree. For those of you in the US where the AC is typically just cranked up all the time, you probably agree that we're freezing most of the time. Sound privacy has become a big issue with open offices, right? Now, we do know that we perform better under certain conditions. For daylighting, you know, there's research that has shown, and this is just, I'm showing just the results of one study, but there's plenty of studies that show that there is a significant increase in performance with students and occupants and office workers that are exposed to daylight in terms of performance. We also perform better with views, and what's interesting is that views tend to actually have more of an impact than daylight. Our connection to the outside, in particular to the dynamic outside, is very important. And what research has shown is that it's actually the fact that the outside is dynamic, it allows their brains to get distracted in a way that allows us to think better, actually. It's very interesting. This is research that has been published in the last few months. And so we perform better with views. We also perform better with thermal comfort. Glad that there is data on it, but I think we would all agree just empirically that we perform better if we are feeling not too warm, not too cold. And this is very important as we talk, those of us in practice, talk to those who will be implementing these strategies or with whom we're trying to work on creating better environments that, you know, that foster wellness. We perform also, as I mentioned, perform better with views and thermal comfort. So people who had views, but also were thermally comfortable, were actually more focused. So there's also cross effects between these variables, and it's very interesting. I'll give you access to these slides, and you'll have access to the references if you want to look back at them. We also perform better, and many of you might be familiar with this research, with better indoor air quality. The Harvard School of Public Health has published a large amount of data that shows that CO2 levels, the more they increase, the worse we perform. And so in PM, particulate matter, et cetera. And so it's very important. Indoor air quality also leads to higher performance. We perform worse if there's high PM count, particulate matter, right? So cooking is, in most of our countries, still a driving source of particulate matter in homes, right? Most of us still cook with gas. What does that mean? Or light candles up. That means that we are generating particulate matter out of combustion regularly in our environments. Well, it turns out that high levels of particulate matter really decrease our performance, our cognitive performance. We also perform worse where there are any of you in San Francisco or in Australia where there are fires out there, right? And so high particulate matter outside, so outdoor air quality, can also have a great impact on how we perform, because outdoor air quality eventually becomes indoor air quality. Natural ventilation is one strategy that makes us feel better. There's a lot of research, and this research is actually a little bit outdated, meaning that, you know, it's really only all the way to 2005, but there has been in the last 20 years even more research that shows that using natural ventilation, this is the pink, has a significant decrease in sick building syndrome symptoms, as well as other strategies, the use of indoor plants, daylight, and window views, as I've mentioned earlier. But in particular, natural ventilation, another strategy to use. Now, we also perform worse under glare, right? And so we talk about more daylight, but more daylight needs to be controlled. These are examples that I use repeatedly with clients where they try to argue that more daylight, because, you know, science proves that more daylight is better for all of us. So let's just use more daylight. Let's have an all glass building. Well, buildings will be rendered, and architects will render buildings without any of these shades, and they're going to make them look all beautiful and transparent. And so clients fall in love with that transparency. Their reality is that people need shade, and the more glass you provide, the more shade there will be. This is an example where interior shades were provided. This is an example where interior shades were not provided, and occupants will figure out a way to prevent glare. to minimize the impact, the negative impact of glare on their performance. But as we're designing buildings, we need to encourage everyone to think about how to eliminate this. I mean, nobody is happy with this outcome, right? Occupants are not happy, the owner's not happy, the architect's not happy, no one's happy. So how can we make sure that we're designing buildings that align with what research shows and maximize occupant performance? And so how do we use that argument? Oftentimes, for those of you who have had to do a payback analysis for, say, exterior shades in a building, I'm going to go back just for this, right? When we say exterior shading in a building and we try to propose it in a project, and someone will say, well, how much is the exterior shading saving me with respect to how much energy am I going to save, right? Oftentimes, depending where you are, but oftentimes, at least in my experience, electricity and gas are so cheap that there's really no way to justify exterior shading with a monetary argument. Oftentimes, you just end up finding that the payback will be 20 years, 30 years, and then people will say, well, it's not worth it. Well, here's the reality of it. We're really not talking about energy savings. Energy savings, we shouldn't even be talking about that, I feel. Even though it's good to talk about it, let's think about how much we are spending on our employees, right? It's really how much, if you think about an employee that is making, I'm going to say $50,000 a year, right? And you as a company are getting a particular productivity from that employee. What if you could make their working environment better and get a boost of, say, 5%? You would be making so much more money than you would be saving through energy savings or anything else. So there is a financial argument and there's an equity argument too. There are a lot of these factors that are gender dependent of the variables that I mentioned, thermal comfort, et cetera, that are gender dependent and also dependent of where we come from, right? Those of us who come from warmer places, like, you know, places to be warmer than people who don't come from those places. And so an equity argument is a place that can provide a comfortable environment for most people, also includes those of us, the women who are always cold, or other people who come from other places that are always cold or always, uncomfortable. And so it's important to think about everyone and be inclusive. And so there's an equity argument and there's a financial argument for wellness that is completely unrelated to energy savings. Now, luckily there is, and this is just one example of institutions that have been doing a lot of research on wellness. The Harvard School of Public Health, as I mentioned, Joe Allen's group subdivides healthy building into 9 different categories that I'm going to let you all read. Again, you're going to get these slides and you can go to the website, which is fabulous and has lots of really interesting information. But there are already foundations. We're not starting with a clean slate, a white page. There's actually a lot of work that has been done, but incorporating healthy building design is really a little bit like group juggling, right? I could come into a room and just show the first slides that I just showed and said, well, it's obvious that we want more proactive people. So let's make the building the way I'm telling you to design it. The reality is that there are many other reasons to have a particular building design that might not be ideal from a daylighting standpoint or from a thermal comfort standpoint. Oftentimes, and to those of you who are architects in the audience, there are views, there's connectivity, there's so many other things that drive design, there's program, there's what the owner wants, right? And so getting to healthy building design really requires understanding what everyone's doing, which is why I love this image. You really need to understand what everyone's doing, need to be on the same page with what everyone wants, and we need to be all juggling together. Sorry, I can only see half my slide. There we go. So costs are a very important factor too. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges that I find on an everyday basis when I work with clients. Challenge number 1 is the glass obsession. Everyone wants a shiny building. Everyone wants breathtaking views. In particular, when you're talking to developers, they'll tell you, what I need, I sell the space empty. And so I need to show the view. I need to show people that they're going to have the exterior come in. And there's also the argument of we're going to have more daylight if we have more glass. As we already mentioned, this is not quite true. You get more light, but also of lesser quality. Now, this is the myth, right? And you saw my image earlier. There's actually someone who did a study in New York City where they went out and counted what percent of the window area is on average shaded or covered by shades in both residential buildings and commercial buildings. And surprise, surprise, there's nothing below 30%. And the median is actually 60%. So think about it. Most buildings have shades drawn, just like this one. And so how can we design so that drawing shades is okay? It does not impact design, but also we minimize the space where shades need to be drawn, where we can maximize the space where no shades need to be drawn, because this also limits how much daylight we're getting and how many views we're getting. This is an example of a lab building in Boston, for any of you in Cambridge, that was meant to be all glass, right? I mean, it is all glass. It was meant to be all transparent, but look at the floor above, right? The shades are drawn down. The cabinets are pulled right against the glass because there's no walls, right? And so the all glass obsession also means that we don't have walls, and so we're going to have to put all the cabinets against this. And where do my views go? So important to keep this in mind. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there is this feeling that we're going to have more daylight with more glass. The reality is that daylight is not very useful. It's not useful. For those of you who know, there are metrics that allow us to quantify useful daylight, and an all glass building will not give you that. Also, we're getting much colder and much warmer in all glass environments. For any of you who live in any of the extremes of the weathers, you will know that standing right next to a cold glass pane of glass in the winter time is terribly uncomfortable and leads to having perimeter heating everywhere. You notice here, they could not get away. We're putting radiators against every single pane of glass because it's going to get really cold. The same happens when it gets really hot, and then they're going to have the AC on top to compensate for that. Perhaps in a climate where this home behind did not need any of those, right? And so glass leads us to need more heating and more cooling because of the thermal comfort needs. This is an example of a project that we worked on, labs, which I work on fairly consistently, are some of the buildings that have this desire, that those in residential that have the desire for having all glass everywhere. And so this is a project where we worked with the developer and walk them through the arguments and show them, look, this is your glass building. This is a building you own. This is what it looked like when it was rendered. This is what it looks like in reality. And you have all your shades drawn. You have all the cabinets right next to the glass. So can we help you design a building that feels glassy, but isn't really? We reduced the amount of glass by 50%. Can you tell? Probably not. This still feels like a very glassy building, but this is actually less than 50% window to wall ratio. We concentrated the glass where we had the need for those views, but we actually reduced it. And again, it doesn't feel like we reduced it that much. And the areas where more daylight control was needed. We included triple pane glass where occupants would be close to the glass, right? And so less glass means we can afford better glass, right? Now our daylight is much more useful than an all glass alternative, which means we need fewer shades, right? The glassy areas were designed for glare control. And so this was actually fine-tuned even further to make sure that occupants down here would not suffer the impact of direct sunlight. And on top of that, this entire building has been designed to reduce carbon emissions by 90% with respect to all the other lab buildings in the area. This is the second challenge that I deal with just about every day. And the reality is that people don't want more fresh air for some reason. Despite of COVID, people think that more fresh air actually means that I'm doubling the amount of equipment that I have in my building. And that's it, right? And so I'm just putting twice as much and I'm not getting anything back. But as we talked about, two times more fresh air is actually going to have a really good payback if you have more productive employees. If you have employees that actually come to work and don't get sick at work because there's no good ventilation, right? And so despite of COVID, there really is still a denial to provide more fresh air. There could be an argument, and this I've heard many times, and we've tackled it, well, more fresh air means that we're going to need more energy to heat it or to cool it. The reality is that heat recovery is pretty good these days. And so more fresh air does not necessarily mean that much energy use in a building. Also, more fresh air can mean a good resilience strategy. And particularly if you're incorporating natural ventilation, either as a standard to the design or as a backup to the design. And I like to show this example. This is a hospital in New Orleans where Katrina hit. And the nurses, so Katrina hit, there was no power in the hospital. And so the nurses had to go around breaking the windows with chairs, the windows of the hospital, and putting the patients right next to the broken windows so that the patients could breathe more air, more fresh air. Can you imagine? We could have just incorporated natural ventilation into this design and we would have been better off in terms of providing better ventilation. For any of you in fire regions like San Francisco, like Australia, you will need clean air, right? And so here we've been talking about bringing in fresh air from the outside, but what if the air outside is not clean? What if the air outside is ash filled, right? Is full of particulate matter? Well, you're gonna need clean air. And this is research done by Elliot Gall at University of Washington, where he has done a fair amount of research on what would it take to reduce the particulate matter in an interior building through air cleaning. And so air cleaning and sealing up the building, right? And how can you do that? And so air cleaning will be needed if your outdoor air is not clean enough. And I haven't grown up in Mexico City, I know what that means, right? And so you need to filter the outside air if you want clean, fresh air. Now, how do we juggle together? How do we make decisions to maximize wellness with as much of an impact as we can in building design? Well, this is what I specialize on. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into the type of work that I do to do this. And that is focusing on early design. Early in the design, when architects are starting to imagine their building, when owners are only starting to imagine what their new place is going to look like. That's the best place to incorporate wellness strategies so that they don't feel like an add-on at the end, and we get everyone on board early on. And so I specialize on running simulations early in design when we're just doing massing studies, for instance, to try to influence that. And so I'll show you some examples of my work there. And so for instance, this is areas where we need more shading or less shading and just a massing strategy, right? This is an example of a project where we were trying to figure out, we had an owner who wanted to go all glass for a residential building. And our team was trying to push for having less glass, similar to that lab building. And so simple simulation strategies for all of you daylight experts, this is something you do every day, and definitely more sophisticated in the research side than in the consulting side. But there are ways to show that the all glass option compared to the punch windows option provides just about the same amount of daylight and provides far less glare, right? Glare is the areas that are overlit, right? And so you could have a much more comfortable environment if you go for an approach that does not have all glass everywhere. They also will ask us, well, yes, but the views are going to be far fewer. Well, not really. And there's a way to quantify views. This is something that our team did. And sure, you're going to have more views if you're at the back of the apartment. You're going to have more than 20 degrees angle for it to get this view, to get to look at the skylight. But in reality, you don't lose that much of views if you reduce the amount of windows that you have. And so quantifying it and showing it as a number is a much more powerful argument than saying, well, not really, without necessarily having data to back it up. Additionally, we can add the layer of comfort. And so this was an area, this was actually in a building in New York, where in the wintertime, we know that an all glass building is going to create this cold downdraft, right? Really close to the windows. And so you can see that these areas right here, we're going to need to install perimeter heating, and they're going to be cold inevitably, right? Whereas if you incorporate more solid wall and less glass, it's actually very comfortable before even introducing the perimeter heating. So you're creating already a space that is conducive to wellness and is less expensive because you're saving money on one system, right? If you design well, you're not in certain areas and certain climates, and certainly New York, you can save the use of perimeter heating. And so this also allows us to quantify our, the financial benefits in general of our space. And so this is an example where we worked with the architect and the mechanical engineer. This was actually the mechanical engineer who brought us in because they were very interested in keeping exterior shading for the sizing of their systems. To evaluate the impact of this exterior shading in other exterior shading strategies. There's actually an overhang here and around the building. This is overhead. You can't quite see it, but there's a fair amount of very smart shading all around this building that you can see it here as well, some self shading that was about to go off the design because it was not, it was expensive, right? And so they brought us in to quantify this. So this is how we quantified it. And we knew that the argument had to be financial, again, because we know we're not going to win with the argument of energy savings, right? And so we said, well, these are the occupants that are most impacted by the facade design decisions. And so what we do on the facade to someone who's sitting here is really not going to make much of a difference. So let's just say this was a medical building, right? You have roughly 300 occupants there who make roughly $100,000 a year. This is doctors, and so they're definitely making more than that, but we decided to choose an average, right? So we're talking about $34 million a year of just salary costs, right? Imagine that we're only increasing. You saw my numbers, and my numbers and increase of in performance were in the vicinity of 5 to 10 to 15%. Let's just say we only get 1% of productivity increase by the occupants in the perimeter. You will already be saving $340,000 a year. Your annual utilities for the entire building. So how much you're paying for energy for the entire building is $360,000 a year, right? So this is already comparable to your entire energy bill of a medical building, right? It puts it in perspective, right? And so our energy savings argument is really not the place here because we would be saving maybe $2,000 a year, right? But from a health standpoint, from a wellness standpoint, there's really an argument. Now, the research is happening. The Harvard School of Public Health is doing research. There's great institutions. There's many of you who are doing great research, and we'll learn about this through the program at this conference. And so the question I'm leaving to you is, how can we bridge that gap between the research and the practice and the owners so that we can quantify these benefits better and lead to better performance in our buildings? And with that, that was it. I would like to open the questions and a conversation, and I don't know how that's going to happen. I see some comments on the chat, but haven't read them. So I'm going to wait for someone. Elizabeth, can you walk me through this?
Yep, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that amazing presentation. It looks like Mark has the first question. So Mark, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Certainly. Well, thank you so very much for your presentation. I think that back in the 1980s, of course, I was lucky enough to have a professor who got on board with Fitch's work and really kind of drilled this in at the very basic level. And I just also think that one thing we never talked about, certainly in my own practice, which has been abandoned for these last 30 years, but also in my work as an administrator in the faculty, that there's a need to modify the environment. And I don't really think about Thomas Kundig, but I kind of like that as an image, that somehow there is a means that we can change our environment. And by doing so, we're kind of tuning the space to our sense of well-being. And I'm wondering exactly how important that is, or maybe I'm just imagining it because I like to touch my buildings.
Are you referring to a more personalized space? So the ability of creating our own space?
No, I mean, tuning it like one would. I'm a sailor, so I sail. Well, I pretend to be a sailor. Just adjusting the sheets, tightening it up, pulling it in. Those small adjustments, whether it's modification to external blind systems, I don't mean Venetian blinds, which are there, but any little modifications. I mean, even, when I spend time in Europe, I love the fact that in Italy, every day, they open the windows.
Yep.
In the winter, new air comes in. You've got shutters. You've got different levels of shutters. You've got vertical blinds, which are set within the frame of the wall,
Yep.
and you have internal screens. Yes. So those little mechanisms make me feel more connected to the space.
Yeah, and this is you're bringing up such a good point. And I have to say, I have been living in Europe for the last year and a half, and still consulted in the US, and so I have come to feel that every day when people say, well, that technology doesn't work, and I look at my building from the 1960s, and I'm like, well, this is a building from the 60s, and we're using it. There are certain areas in certain areas in the world where a connection to your building is desired, right? There is a French expression called that says that you have to feel the seasons come in and out, right? You have to just let the building let you feel the seasons. There are other cultures where all of this patchwork that we're talking about, right? Let's design the building so that is done so that we can design the building and you don't need to think about your building anymore. Your building does everything for you and you don't need to think that you need to interact. And it's frustrating because there's so many other places where it's actually where people consider it enjoyable to open the shutters, right? You see the shutters in the US and they're fake. They're not even the right size for windows, right? People paid for them, right? People actually paid for them. People paid to paint them every year. People paid to put them there. They did not pay to close them and open them, right? It's a culture. I think it's a cultural issue, and I do not know how to, not being American, right? I feel very much like you, where my interaction with buildings is very important. Feeling the breeze, being able to regulate that is a need, but we have to recognize that there's just cultures that just need that control, right? And if anyone has something to say, I would love to, to get some thoughts on that. But very good points. My life would be so much easier if people understood that.
Thank you. It looks like Mary had a question. Mary, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I have. Thank you very much for a really important and very interesting talk. I'm particularly, of course, interested in what you say about wellness and your last comments there about the relationship between design, culture, science, and money, if we added that into the mix. But my question to you, and maybe it's a bit hard to ask, is wellness a category that has regulations in building codes? Right. So are there any examples where building codes, not design, I understand the design and teaching people about design principles, but in building regulations where the wellness is factored into anywhere in the planet, as a consideration? And how would they be, if they were regulations, how would they be kind of followed up?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in my knowledge of codes, US and international, there are definitely codes that will prescribe minimum performance, right? So for any of you in the US, ASHRAE 62.1 provides minimum ventilation for adequate indoor air quality. If you actually get into the details of what that means, it refers to something funky called Occupant Comfort. They, for liability reasons, do not talk about health in ventilation, if you can believe that, right? And so a lot of the research that has been done, particularly in the last 2 years, is frustratingly not necessarily being incorporated into 62.1 because 62.1 is driven by other factors. So all this to say, there are codes that prescribe minimum performance. So thermal comfort, ASHRAE 55, and there's other codes in the UK and other countries that will prescribe minimum performance. Some of them will focus on just the temperatures. Some of them will just say, do your best, right? They won't give a temperature. They will just say the design should follow. But none of that is what I would call wellness, right? They're prescriptive numbers that are already not capturing the entirety of your population. They're not capturing the nuances of who's occupying your building, right? It's very different to prescribe a building to be at, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, so 21 degrees Celsius, for someone who works in a laboratory, to a kid, right? A kindergarten kid, right? Very different. And yet, oftentimes these codes are prescriptive to both. And so wellness is more of an aspiration right now. And it is followed through many, as you probably know, certification programs. So the Well Building Standard try to do that, basically try to say, well, what research is there out there, and can we set a higher bar for those who really want to do it? Can we set a higher bar so that they can quantify by how much they've done, right? And those typically prescribe much more ventilation than what ASHRAE would prescribe, etc. And so they exist, but codes are very slow to permeate and really are focused on defining minimum acceptable performance. And so it really depends to the country to define that.
Right. And since there's not another question, I'll ask something else of you. There was a building in Sydney, Australia, that was built for engineering at the University of Technology. And they built it without window. The window was right at the very top because they thought light would be distracting to the engineers. So the engineers then just built tables and tables and tried to get up to the light. So that question of light, which you spoke about really, really well, it happens with schools too, no windows, in order for the light not, for distraction to be removed. So the question about culture is so important, isn't it? And the understanding of what well-being means, like in the European context, there are old buildings where wellness was considered differently, and in the America or Australia, these new buildings, take other kind of ideas into account. How do you react to those differences?
Yeah, I would say that you bring up an interesting point. There is subjectivity, right? Cultural differences. I like things this way. So to Mark's point, I like to feel my building. I like to feel, and there's objectivity. There is research that very clearly proves that kids' performance is higher with higher levels of daylight. There's no argument about that. And we should not be arguing about that, right? And so you might like how you operate your building, but let's just talk about the fact that daylight is good for humans, and that's how it has to be.
Right.
Interestingly, part of my grad school, my office was in the first floor. I did not focus on buildings. I was doing a master's in aerospace engineering, and so daylighting and those things were not really in my mind yet. And a year and a half into my master's, I have gone in and out of this building every day for a year and a half. I mentioned to a professor, my office was on the perimeter of that building, a building that it was a brutalist building that had decided not to put windows on the first floor. I mentioned that we were on the basement, and everyone looked at me and said, well, we're not on the basement. You do realize that you never go down when you come into the building, and we never go back up. You do realize we're on the first floor. It never occurred to me, even though I was regularly going into the first floor and was conscious that it was ground level and street level, that that I had access to daylight, and no one, and someone decided not to give it to me, right? Many occupants don't, or just take that as a given. It's like, well, there's no windows. I think we need to be objective about the things that you are all doing research about. We have research that proves certain things. We need to stick to those. How do we sell it is different. And so in my job, I need to figure out the ways to sell it. And oftentimes it's through the side door, right? I stop mentioning energy. Sometimes I don't even mention wellness. I just mention your building's not going to look that pretty, and they care about that. So I just slip it in there, and then we have a better building that makes people happier, and they're going to pat themselves on the back, but I'm not going to tell them that we're doing it for those reasons.
Well, good luck and strength to you.
Thank you.
We need more. Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like Bill has a question. Bill, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I'm unmuted now. You know, you mentioned a couple of times about the economics of these situations, and if I'm not wrong, I'm not a builder or an architect, but if I'm not wrong, glass is the cheapest way to build a big building. So you know, people are not doing glass really for the views or the light or the whether it's too much or not enough. It's really about simply the economics of it. And one of the question I want to ask you is about what are the connections between the constraints of economics and what actually happens with building. So for example, you know, if a developer's building a building, it doesn't really matter what happens once they've sold it. You know what I mean? I mean, that their objectives are short term, right? And we operate in an environment where a lot of objectives around the market are short term. They're either, so I'm building the building, then I sell it, and it really doesn't matter that much, or I operate in terms of financial years where my framework for looking at stuff is short term and financial as opposed to qualitative. So, you know, how do you balance those kinds of tensions?
Yes, great question. Two thoughts come to mind. The first one is we think glass is cheaper, and it is on a unit basis, but you need to remember that to manage the interior, the environment, given that glass choice, you need to put a much larger mechanical system, right? And so we're really not used to telling the mechanical engineer will typically assume that the architect will, even though there's high aspirations to put, say, triple pane glass, that the architect will end up defaulting to the lowest performance possible, just by costing, et cetera, you know, through costing exercises, et cetera, just because they're just trying to be safe, right? They don't want to give the news to the architect, oh, well, since you decided to have cheaper glass, you need more systems, right? And so they tend to be safe and say, well, you're going to need this much, you need this much space. What we've started to do is require and encourage our teams to, every time there's a line item on the budget, in particular in what's called value engineering in the US, which is where you make a list of all the things, oh, we're over budget, which things could we be taking off to make the, you know, the building cheaper? That every time there's an envelope item, like going from triple pane glass to double pane glass, or lowering the performance of your glass, that there is immediately a line that relates to what the impact of the mechanical system is. Because if you're going to have worse performing glass, you're going to need perimeter heating, right? And so we've had many projects where we prove that using triple pane glass is cheaper or cost neutral with respect to double pane glass, just because your double pane glass comes with double pane glass and perimeter heating, which you need to maintain, install, you're losing valuable, usable area, etc. And so there are arguments, and so this is not necessarily an argument versus solid wall or glass, but I'm just trying to point out that we tend to think that the glass is just that square foot or square meter of glass, but in reality, each one of those comes with a little bit of air conditioning or heating with it, right? And so the better glass or the more wall you put in, most of those you're saving. From a global warming standpoint, and we have done a fair amount of work in policy development, and particularly with the city of Boston, where the city of Boston hired us to ask, how can we encourage everyone, not just the best buildings, but the entire portfolio, developers, everyone, to strive to help us meet our goals for carbon neutrality. Really, the only way we're going to get to carbon neutrality is with all electric buildings. And you can have a developer that will tell you an all electric building is extremely expensive. If I take my building and then just switch all my systems to all electric, I can't pay for that. It's unaffordable, right? And that tends to be the argument to the city. You can't force me to do that because it's really expensive. Well, the reality is that if you've designed your envelope properly and you've minimized how much glass you have, switching to electric is oftentimes cost neutral because you've designed your envelope well, so you don't have a mechanically heavy building, right? And so cities are trying to encourage, because cities are investing a lot on meeting their carbon neutrality goals, are really focusing on making sure, and this goes back to legislation, this is not related to wellness necessarily, but energy. There's many cities that are starting to be much stricter about what envelopes you can put in a building. So you can just no longer, in Boston, you can no longer have all glass buildings, period. That's by law, you cannot. And so by doing that, then you're automatically making the buildings more comfortable and more efficient. And they're actually not that much more expensive because people are learning how to do that. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that in reality, it's not that much more expensive if you think about everything. And then finally, thinking about developers, we've been working, the lab building that I showed is actually a developer building. What that means is that it's the tenant that will be paying for the utilities, right? But it's the tenant that will gain the productivity too, right? And so they can attract tenants, they can attract the Google and the Facebook, where their employees are actually asking for a more comfortable environment. They'll be able to attract them more easily as tenants and charge a higher fee for the lease than if they had not gone through these strategies. And employees are asking for wellness so much, and particularly the last 2 years. I mean, people are moving companies because of wellness, right? And so it's very important, and it becomes a higher lease. And so for a developer that will be leasing, it's important. For one that will be selling, there's just different arguments to make. And so I would not say it's a lost battle. There are ways to do it. You're welcome.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? It looks like we have time for one more. Feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or type in the chat and we can call on you to ask. Oh, it looks like Natalia has a comment. Did you want to unmute yourself and say your comment or ask your question, Natalia?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi from Poland. Thank you for your presentation. As I wrote on the chat, your last question during your presentation is very interesting, and a similar question: how to combine the knowledge and the practice, how to combine it, also drive me to my research, but I'm trying to combine research and practice in the particular the school building context, and as far as I know, and I'm doing my research, I think there is something like architectural education, and it's not for professionals, but it is for users of architecture, even for children. So if we teach children what they should have in buildings, that they should have discomfort, and they can require it from architects, it can they are more conscious about the the space they are using. So the requirements of their knowledge as investors, then architects and users of the different buildings is bigger and bigger, and it can change something in this. So maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think education is the best way to have this conversation. There's many of these topics that were not, I mean, I specialize on ventilation. I can tell you that pre-COVID, it was not interesting to anyone, right? Now it is, now people are calling and saying, hey, what do you think about the ventilation? In particular, I remember maybe 4 years ago, having a friend of mine who develops CO2 sensors and going to his house and seeing, he works for the Harvard School of Public Health. And so he has all these sensors, and we were talking about performance, you know, cognitive performance. And know the numbers roughly for ppm, CO2 levels, but I've never had a sensor in front of me, right? And I remember being in his house and noticing that our CO2 levels were way too high, to levels that I thought were unhealthy. And he said, no, it's normal. It's wintertime. We're 10 people inside of the house. So this is when I opened the window. I remember talking to mechanical engineers and telling them we were at 10,000 ppm inside of the house. And they said, impossible, you would have died. And I said, no, the reality is that none of us knows how much, temperature. We have sensors, so we have a sense. If I tell you 26 versus 22, you know what that means, right? We talk about it every day. We don't talk about CO2 or particulate matter concentration. People don't know that turning on a gas stove makes their particulate matter spike in their entire house. They don't know that, right? People don't know that CO2 levels in schools are really high. And so I think that one of the silver lining of this pandemic is that there are more and more schools that are installing CO2 sensors just to know whether they should be opening a window or not. And hopefully children and just people in general will learn to recognize that and ask for that and say, well, what ppm are you designing my building, right? Mm-hmm. And hopefully that will make us more educated. If those terms are not even in the thoughts or the words of people, it's really hard to convince them that it's valuable, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like we're coming to the end of our hour. Kayla posted the link for the discussion board to continue the discussion or ask more questions. And she also posted the link for the conference schedule for tomorrow's sessions. Tomorrow we have a couple more plenary sessions in the morning. Thank you, Alejandra, for that amazing presentation. This recording will be uploaded a little later today, so you'll be able to go back and watch it and continue the discussion on the discussion board. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I hope you have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.